Now, ladies and gentlemen, we're one presentation short to go, and next I'm going to bring to the stage Juho Paasonen, our beloved head of design from SC5. But before I let Juho do the talking, I think we're going to do a little bit small exercise with all of you, because I know that the air doesn't contain too much oxygen, but it might help if we all stand up and have a wave at the camera, because I know that there are still some people watching. So please stand up and wave at the camera. We are here, you can hear us, and now you can see us. Okay, thank you. This should give us some sort of boost for the remaining 15 minutes so we don't kind of starve or suffocate here. And now it's time for Juho show to start.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much, Lassi. Actually, Lassi gave me a headline, which was what is in it for design, and maybe just to piss him off, I actually changed my topic to talking about the cultural change and some of the things that were actually already mentioned by Olaf. So I'm actually glad to hear you talk about that stuff. My personal history is that I'm actually the designer who studied psychology. So there are a few of us around. And what I'm actually specialized in is design management and how design thinking actually transforms organizations and how organizations should actually embrace design and data-driven design. And over the past 17 years or so, I've been working in different kind of big and small organizations, like at Nokia Design, where I was heading different kinds of strategic projects around multi-channel design and different kinds of first-time use experience exercises, for example. And now over the past year, I've basically been building our design capability and our service design unit, which is looking things more from the angle of how to integrate development work and design work seamlessly together. I think one thing that's kind of obvious when you talk about these things and how to actually change organizations to embrace design thinking or data-driven design, you kind of have to take it all with a grain of salt. These are all my personal observations, and you can feel free to disagree with me, or you can take my entire presentation as an act of stand-up comedy if you want. That's perfectly okay with me. I'm just going to talk about some experiences I've had with working as a change agent, both inside organizations and outside organizations as a consultant. So when I'm talking about design change management, I know it's a pompous word, but I'm actually talking about just doing this conscious exercise in figuring out how an organization should deal with design and how organizations should deal with data as it comes to design. And the funny thing about design change management as a term is that change management as a term is already outdated, and the better job we do, the faster design change management deprecates as a term. So what I want to do is I want to make sure that after 4 or 5 years, all organizations embrace data-driven design and all these human-centered design methodologies, so that I can go on and do something else with my life. I don't have to explain data-driven design to any of you, so I can just basically skip this slide. I'm kind of used to doing this presentation for people who've never actually done data-driven design. So it's refreshing to talk to people who know way more about data-driven design than I do, because I'm actually really bad with numbers. My forte is just making sure that organizations actually understand the benefits of data-driven design and really just embrace the process as a whole. So the first thing you gotta know about making changes in organizations towards data-driven design or any kind of human-centered design thinking is that it's all about the strategy. It's not really about the execution. It's about having some kind of a practice or having the strategy in place to embrace it. I'm always talking about the will. You can't really have any kind of practice if you don't have the will to change and the will to embrace these kind of things. And when you kind of go to these organizations and talk about business versus design versus technology versus data, you always kind of get into this weird discussion that design and business are different things. And I think this is actually part of what Laura was also mentioning. In my mind, design is part of the business. I mean, if you think about Janne's great talk about how Veikkaus has embraced design as part of their business, I think it's pretty obvious that business equals design and design equals business. And there's this really annoying term I hate, which is digital disruption and digitalization. But when it all comes down to it, there's actually some truth behind it. There's three elements: there's business, design, and technology. And these three things combined really change the organizations. And I guess it all comes down to this. So you got your hierarchy of need. And when there's an organization that doesn't really know what to do with their design and doesn't really know how to build data-driven models or such, you gotta have three larger things. First of all, you gotta have the will to change. And this is where most organizations already fail. Like, there is no will to embrace data-driven design because we've obviously done this before and we know everything about our customers and so forth. So you gotta have to go past the step of making them understand that they need to change. And it's actually not that hard. You just kind of have to point out good examples, and you gotta have to make them understand that making the decision to change is only the first step. You gotta have the people who take all that in and kind of just really take that into their heart and be advocates for that. And I think that was kind of part of what Olaf was talking about earlier. The other thing you gotta have is you gotta have a strategy and you gotta have a process. And this is actually one of the things that help you when you're building this in an organization. I mean, it's not just about saying that now you have to move into a data-driven model, or it's not about having 500 people who work in analytics and 150 people who work in design. You really gotta have to have a plan on how you're actually attempting to change things via data. And there's plenty of good models for that we've been discussing on several different presentations here today. I think the last thing that's pretty obvious is that you really got to collect the data, and I emphasize always that you really have to have the follow-through. So it's not only about making educated guesses against the data that you can pull from the users. It's also about making sure that there's always a follow-through plan on everything that you're doing. So the way I personally and the way SC5 sees it is that there is kind of like a basic model on figuring out how to build organizations that work in a data-driven way. And where it all starts is the business modeling and really understanding what's the business model of an organization. It ties back to the KPIs that I think a lot of us were talking about today. So you got to have a bunch of sharp KPIs that you build against on, and those KPIs actually have to come from your business model. So you got to make sure that there's a strong link between what your larger business goals are and what your actual KPIs are in the analytics. And based on that, what we're kind of used to do is building things from a life cycle perspective, like really making sure that all departments, all projects, all services build against life cycles. Like, you have services and you've got your customers and you've got users in individual services, and you want to make sure that there's a life cycle behind it. Just build a model on your service. Really make sure that each of your user groups have their own life cycles, and even though you're working in a lean way and want to react to changes, know that you have a big picture somewhere at the back of your head. So that basically spawns ideas of services. Like, you've got your seeds for services that you start experimenting on. So you know your customers, you roughly know what kind of life cycle you wanna build your services on, and then you start experimenting. You put something out there, you measure it against the larger business goals, you analyze, you iterate, you go back to square A and do something else. So that kind of gives you the fundamentals to build a service process. Like, when you're building a new service, you can basically build it from scratch by just experimenting. But if you really want to make sure that everybody embraces that and your model inside the organization, you have to have an underlying process on how that actually maps into the organization. So you have to have everybody on board, and you have to tie all the different stakeholders together. You usually have to go all the way to the C-suite to talk about these things. And I'm actually glad to hear that there's plenty of organizations out there who have this in their blood and just like really embrace things all the way to the top, because that's actually relatively rare from from my perspective, is still in Finland. So we're kind of learning that, but we're still far away from actually having a large number of organizations that have this in their hearts. The last part is pretty obvious. So you build your MVPs, and with the MVPs, you prove that there is value in learning from the data. There's really there's no bigger wizardry inside it. It's just a matter of having the data, collecting the data, and making sure that that data is used. So the part that I'm going to focus on is how to actually kind of communicate the change and make sure that the organizations really take the change into their heart as a conscious act. So one of the things that I always talk about is that there needs to be a driver. There needs to be a sharp guy like Olaf who wants to build a data-driven culture and really wants to take things forward. It doesn't have to culminate into one individual, but I've actually noticed that if you have one individual who's really sharp and really have this in his or her heart, that actually helps. Hence my example of Steve Jobs. But obviously you also have to have the people who do the heavy lifting in the analytics side. And the way it's usually built, I've noticed, is that there are two different entities. One entity is usually looking after the big data and the numbers, and there's a separate entity for design. I'm not sure how the organization is in Janne, in your organization, if you want to weigh in. Do you have analytics as a separate team, or do you also have analytics inbuilt into the design teams?
We do have a business intelligence department, sort of, or team, but the thing in data-driven design, that work is done by individual analysts who are a core part of the team that they work in.
Right, and this is actually the model that I've seen working pretty well. There's value in having a different sort of business intelligence team that kind of gathers intelligence also on things that are kind of outside the radar for the design team. But it's very useful to have the analysts within the design team, or even better, have designers who actually have experience in doing more advanced analysis. So either way, you start with the will. You've explained to the organization that we need to change and we need to embrace data-driven design. We need to embrace HCD. And what you need next is an actual spark. Some organizations just have the spark. They get it immediately. They understand how things work, and they really want to change. But the thing you most often actually have to explain that it's about the money. One of my favorite quotes ever from anyone is from Arnold Schwarzenegger, who actually said in an interview that money doesn't make you happy. I was equally happy with 5 million than 15 million. That stuff always cracks me up. So there's a fair amount of organizations in the world and in Finland. You would be surprised the size of organizations where you actually still have to explain the benefits of human-centered approach, not to mention data-driven design. So this is the kind of stuff that I've used for dummies, which in this case are EVPs and the C-suite people. Like, there's three things that always work. You can talk about finding new revenue streams with fresh insight. You can talk about cost reduction when you're narrowing the focus into something meaningful, and understanding your customer. So these are the three things that usually sell it. But the bottom line is that you actually need to have a mandate. Like, you have to build a model that can get you the mandate to really drive changes in an organization, and you have to hire a bunch of really smart cross-disciplinary people around you. I always say that if you notice that you're the smartest person in the room, you're doing something wrong. And that kind of gets me back to getting everybody on board. And I actually really liked how Olaf was talking about earlier about having this kind of hierarchical approach and things that need to happen in an entire organization for this to work. So you really have to get everybody on board when you're building something like this. Like, if you're building just an HCD angled organization or having it embrace data-driven design, everybody needs to be on board, and everybody needs to understand how that works. So design strategy is actually a good tool for defining it. And I know I'm kind of talking about things from the designers and design management's perspective, but I think that's actually kind of fresh compared to some of the presentations from today. So there's 4 things that can actually help you build a data-driven organization if your organization already wants to become more human-centered. So design philosophy is usually something that we kind of neglect because it sounds like it's fuzzy and doesn't really have a connection to business. But one of the things that you can actually do by leaning on to design philosophy is that you can use it as a tool to build a data-driven culture. I mean, you can always say that one of the principles that we're basing our design work on is that there always has to be both a subjective and objective side to every single project that we do. Another thing is design roadmap. I mean, you've got your evolutionary timeline and you've got your revolutionary timeline, and this also applies to product roadmaps. So one of the clearest ways of utilizing data in design is making sure that you actually have a meaningful roadmap. This is an easy sell. And then the foresight on what's actually happening instead of what you're thinking is happening. And the 4th one is actually not that relevant for this discussion, but it's actually something that you can do with the data. You can actually build a digital brand on top of data that you've learned from the users and how they use your services. I think this is how you kind of sell these things inside organizations and for decision makers. Like, first of all, you got to make sure that whatever you're doing is helping the C-suite with the business goals that they have, which ties back to my earlier point about making your KPIs meaningful for business, and it actually connects to a lot of the other presentations from today. Convincing the board of directors is actually something that you might not have the chance to do when you're working in a huge organization, but it helps tremendously if you actually have the access to the board of directors. There's a lot of organizations that are super willing to actually let you talk to the board of directors if you know what you're talking about. So it's a great way of actually having them excited about the possibilities of data-driven design and the human-centered approach in general. And then what you want to do is you want to empower the entire organization by, first of all, getting the business VPs on board so that the product management and service management can actually do their jobs properly. So what you want to do is you want to empower individual teams to make decisions by themselves. And this is pretty obvious also in the other presentations that we've talked about. And one of the things that I like to do is if there's resistance in or if there's some kind of a gap between why decision makers, why you're using data and how the decision makers see it, you can always track them to observe either the analysis that you're doing, give them the hard data, or track them to the small data side and actually have them participate in user testing. I think this is pretty much my last slide because I'm running out of time, but I would really want everybody to get this tattooed on their backs. So when you're actually going into the mode of having your empowered teams and having the will and having had the organizational backing to really do your job properly in a data-driven way, you should always make sure that the MVPs that you're building are not just functional, but actually rather functional, reliable, usable, and emotional for individual user segments at once. So rather than building crap for everybody, you build something awesome for one specific group of people. Now, I am running out of time, so I'm just gonna skip to my last slide. Like I said, I'm actually used to doing this in 2 hours instead of 20 minutes, but bear with me. So this is basically my mantra. I always say that without will, there can't be people. And with that, I mean that if an organization is not ready to change, there's no way they're going to hire people to make sure that there's a data-driven model or even a human-centered model in place. And without people, there's no strategy. And if you don't build a strategy, it's incredibly hard to actually get the entire organization to follow you in this. If you don't have a strategy, there's not going to be a process. And if you don't have a process, then there's really no proper way of doing things. And if there's no process, things won't change. And the most important part is that if you do change and you don't really measure everything, if you don't have the data, then there was no point in making that change altogether. So good, challenge bravely, listen humbly, and use that data. Thank you very much.